Good morning, everyone. Let the record show that we have a quorum, and I call a meeting to order at 10:15. Just a little bit of housekeeping. I guess in defense of the Public Accounts Committee, I have to make a short comment on the editorial in today's Compass. Well, the Compass believes that it was not a, shall we say, a good, efficient, effective value for money to have sent two members of the Public Accounts Committee to the United Kingdom for training. I happen to take issue with that. I think it's very important that particularly new members of the PAC get whatever training is available in order to facilitate us functioning to our most efficient and effective level as a committee. So I'm a little bit disappointed that the editor took the stance that they have in the Compass today. And I guess I'll just leave it at that.
Well, Mr. Chairman, certainly through you, I want to, and on behalf of my colleague, I want to thank you and the Public Accounts Committee for affording us that 4-day learning opportunity. Whilst I'm sure the member from, I think it's West Bay North, would otherwise attest, it was indeed an enlightening opportunity, very informative, and we hope to apply those skills that were learned to the work of this Public Accounts Committee. And again, we thank you and the entire committee for affording us that training opportunity.
Well, we're dealing this morning with the Auditor General's report on workforce planning and management in the Cayman Islands government, dated April 2018. Our first witness is Honorable Gloria McField Nixon, Acting Deputy Governor. So I'll ask the Sergeant at Arms to please bring her in at this point, please.
I swear by Almighty God that the evidence I shall give to this honorable legislative assembly shall be the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth.
Thank you and good morning, Ms. Gloria McField, and the committee wishes to thank you for taking the time to come down here. We know you're here today as the Acting Deputy Governor, so I'm sure the preparations for the arrival of the new governor would otherwise occupy your time, so we appreciate getting some of your time. As you will have been made aware, we are today doing hearings in the workforce planning and management of the Cayman Islands government. And you also would be aware that we have the acting chief officer, which would be in your normal position. So this morning, if we tend to cross the roles in questioning, forgive us, but we're just trying to get to the truth. So open the floor for questions. Mr. Austin.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and a very good morning to the Honorable Acting Deputy Governor for being with us this morning. Thank you for taking time away from your otherwise busy schedule to join us and help provide some clarity and, if you will, elucidation to the matters at hand. Mr. Chairman, through you, I have two questions for the Deputy Governor, related first to the IT resource and information that supports workforce planning, as outlined by the Auditor General's report, and the second, relevant to the human element of workforce planning for civil servants. I know that my first question has to do with technology and the proper and efficient use of it, but I'd like to note, Mr. Chairman, that we have not invited anyone from computer services or otherwise who perhaps may have more technical expertise. I don't know whether that was an oversight or otherwise, but I'm sure and have every confidence in the Deputy Governor to be capable in responding, but certainly I offer up the caveat that if the questions are in fact technical in nature, that perhaps the Deputy Governor may not be the appropriate person, but I will strive on nonetheless. I trust, Deputy Governor, you have the copy of the AG report in question, Workforce Planning and Management in the Cayman Islands Government. If you will kindly turn to page 34 of the report, looking at specifically sections 86, 87, and 88. The report states, and I quote, "Reliable and timely data are an essential component of workforce planning and management. To effectively inform decision-making, HR data needs to be accessible in real time, analyzed to show historical trends, and provide forecasts and projects. The Auditor General continues to remark, however, that government's HR systems, of which 5 different systems are in use, are neither integrated nor user-friendly, which has led to inefficiencies. All of these systems require staff to input data and lack any predictive decision-making capabilities, making it very difficult to extract any useful information." My question, therefore, Mr. Chairman, through you, relates to what specific IT-based systems are in place. And if I could offer up some context, I've often wondered during the last year and a half, and both in my previous life, why the government, and in particular the Computer Services Department, insists on proprietary software, meaning they have to write the specific code needed to achieve either very specific or even sometimes even general IT tasks, when a more economic and efficient software package may be purchased off the shelf. I give an example of QuickBooks, just as an example, versus a proprietary-based accounting system used solely for the purposes of government. Here in the 21st century, we accept that computers and technology allow for faster processing of data, easier retrieval of information, and promote efficiencies through automation. So my question to you, Deputy Governor, is can you tell us, therefore, what work has been done to improve the IT systems that support the various HR systems which are intended to make both strategic planning and decision-making easier as part of your overall workforce planning and HR exercises?
Through you, Mr. Chairman, and I thank the member for his question. I believe as the day unfolds, we will return to this point often to talk about the data that is available across the civil service to allow us to do the type of forecasting that workforce planning very much relies upon. The member asked, what are the systems that are available to us, and why do we seem to have so much reliance upon proprietary systems that were specifically written in-house for use in HR management. The report that the member refers to, the OAG report, and specifically paragraph 87, says, and I quote, "The government uses 5 different HR systems to collect and manage a range of workforce information. These include HR Iris, an extension of the financial management system Iris, electronic content management ECM, electronic performance management EPM, time recording system TRS, and leave tracker." It may be, if I could put that information in context, the only integrated module available to HR professionals and to managers who would seek to obtain information about their employee base is what we refer to as HR Iris. This is essentially a payroll module that is attached to our finance module. It was driven by the needs coming out of our Ministry of Finance, and it is the only integrated module that we in HR also rely upon because it gives us the demographic information about our employees, information about their contract dates, about their ages, the departments that they work for, salary information. It is a payroll module. The other systems that have arisen out of necessity, and I can say that many of these systems were developed at a time when government was in significant financial constraints. To the credit of the managers who have been at the forefront of adopting these systems, in many instances, these were localized response where our managers did not just rely upon the response that there wasn't adequate funding to buy other integrated systems. They were innovative in their approaches and developed solutions that were intended for use in a department. So for example, our leave tracking system was one that was developed specifically by our computer services department for use in computer services. What we refer to as our electronic performance management system was the portfolio of the civil service response to the concerns that it would take us physically about 3 years to get around to every department to do audits on their performance management. We needed to have central sight of what was happening. And what we refer to as EPM is really just an Excel-based program that we have developed in order to allow persons to do electronic performance management and in order to allow us to have central sight of it. So no excuses were made that we didn't have the funding in place. Where there wasn't a way, departments made a way. And those things where we saw that there were some successes in a localized area, typically a department, that was then rolled out across the service to at least give some interim relief to individuals. So I don't want to condemn the people who, even in this environment where there was no integrated systems, found a way to deliver the work. The challenge with these systems is that the systems, as you've said, are not integrated, they're disjointed. It takes a high degree of individual involvement, input, extracting data, putting it into a common platform, typically again in an Excel format, so that the information can then be manipulated for interpretation. And by the time all that is done, the value is predominantly historical as opposed to being a reliable forecasting tool. But that provides some of the context as to how we got here. Our electronic content management system is a common framework. It allows us to store documents and to share HR information. Specifically, it's used for other purposes as well, but it's the way that we now share information. So contracts that need to go to various parties, whether it be our pensions office or whether it need to be to our HR Iris, the persons that deal with our payroll function, we're no longer physically sending those documents around. We have the ability to file them and to send the links where those documents are stored. So that was a improvement in our workflow management that allowed us to get away from being buried by the amount of paperwork that was created every time a personnel-related document had to be copied 5 or more times in order to go to the parties that needed it to perform some function. But still, those tools, again, rely upon your doing some sort of extraction. It doesn't allow you, for example, to run a report to say how many people have degrees in X or Y, although that information would actually be stored as part of the records that they provided at the time of hire and upon completing training subsequent. So the information is there, but because it lies in these bespoke programs that aren't integrated, the ability to be able to develop the full story and to do cross-planning does require a high level of individuals' time and the ability for them to be able to pull that into a broader picture. We attempt to do that on behalf of the entire civil service each year when we produce our HR trends report. So every year we provide a synopsis of the key trends that are happening across the civil service, and in order to do that, we look at these various systems and try to correlate that information. Individual ministries, portfolios, departments also have access to these records, albeit for their entities, but most rely upon a central service to look at both inputting the data in the first instance as it relates to payroll changes that are happening. We do the vast majority of those on behalf of departments, although there is training available for departments to do that. And certainly when it comes to extrapolating this in the form of a trends report, it tends to be reliance upon the portfolio of the civil service. But ours is going to be across the entity or across the organization as opposed to specifically going into a great deal of detail by department, although there is some departmental information that's provided in terms of the Caymanian versus non-Caymanian, the aging demographics of the departments and leavers and joiners and that sort of thing. So because there's a lack of integration, there tends not to be a great deal of use of the data that is available at an entity level. We are seeking to remedy this, and I would say that it is a most pronounced challenge where the activities are predominantly localized. So because we get certain information about when persons, for example, receive new contracts, that information in the main comes to the portfolio of the civil service. So that's information that we're regularly tracking. But there is other information, for example, how long it takes to fill a post that happens completely out of our sight, completely at a department level. And so that's the type of information that we're not capturing anywhere. Although that information is available at a department level, it tends not to be captured and reported upon at an entity level and then rolling up to a corporate level. So we know that we need to provide better systems that can be relied upon and that are easier for persons in the departments to use. And so one of the key recommendations that came out of this, the Auditor General's report, and indeed that is already within the 5-year strategic plan, is to improve the information systems available, not just to HR, but including to HR for managers. We have begun collating the information that we believe we will need to pull from such a system. What is the type of insights that we want the system to have? We have begun meetings to look at what are the parameters for us in terms of the systems. You mentioned, moving away from the legacy bespoke systems that are being developed in-house, but that still leaves a very broad array of options for us, which includes the way that our finance module is delivered, for example, which is a sort of on-premises, right up to today, much of the software that businesses use would be cloud-based. So looking at what is the full parameters of the options that are available to us, what are the implications for ongoing support, and because we are dealing in HR with a large volume of what we refer to as sensitive records, and being mindful of the upcoming data protection requirements that will also come about, what are the implications of the different technology that's available to us, and how would we have to access any of those? So we've been having those types of meetings to look at the broad context of what's in play for the options that are available when we look to bring in a full suite of integrated HR IT systems. And we are also presently pulling together, again, the types of insights that we would envision needing from the system, and looking at going to the market. We're presently preparing an RFI, not an RFP as yet, an RFI to better test what's available to us within the market, as we're also building out our business processes, because the IT system is only going to be as good as it fulfills what is needed, what the business needs are of the organization. And because of the level of decentralization that happens on a number of core HR functions, I've just mentioned recruitment as a prime example of something that happens completely decentrally. We need to speak to those business partners to make sure that we've taken account of their business needs as well.
Thank you, Deputy Governor. Mr. Chairman, through you, just a few follow-up questions, if I may. First of all, on the issue of integrated systems from a standpoint of both hardware and software. If we look at the hardware aspect in the first instance, I've discovered that certainly within core government, the hardware systems are very PC-based. However, when we look at the statutory authorities, in large majority, they're operating a Mac-based operating system. And where the efficiencies are identified come down in the first instance in terms of space and the amount of equipment. For example, under the PC-based system that core government operates in large majority, we have very large and expansive server rooms which need to be cooled and take up a great deal of space for maintenance and otherwise. Whereas in statutory authorities, some of which are Mac-based, they have replaced entire server rooms with a single server box sitting on a server shelf that fits in a room the size of your average closet. So not only have we saved on space, better use of resources, but undoubtedly we're saving on maintenance resources and other IT-related issues. Perhaps we can talk a little bit about the PC approach versus the Mac approach. Maybe that's a computer services question, a technical question, so I'll understand it. But if we move to the software aspect, I think most peculiar were your remarks regarding, of the 5 HR systems that are in use, only HR Iris, which is an extension of the financial management system, is integrated. You go on to point out, however, that there are common frameworks such as the electronic content management that would be accepted are widely used across all ministries and departments. I would put to you, Madam Deputy Governor, that other common framework software systems outlined by the Auditor General, such as electronic performance management, time recording systems, and leave tracker systems, are otherwise common administrative practices that span every ministry. And where we have it now, the Auditor General pointed out that this, whilst it's not a problem within core government, the problem is the duplication aspect. We have each ministry having their own set of time tracking, content management, recording systems, when perhaps a more economical and efficient use of systems would be in an omnibus, I think perhaps is the choice of words, a centralized hub providing these HR functions, which would provide that efficiency and also create that sort of integrated nature where Ministry A can in fact integrate time tracking, performance management, and recording with Ministry B without having to reinvent the wheel each and every time. And that, of course, creates less costs.
I don't want to go into interpreting what the Auditor General meant in her report. She's present and she can speak to that. But I can tell you from my response, each of these systems has been rolled out across the civil service. No one has gone out to have to get a separate ECM system. People aren't out looking for their own leave tracking system. What I'm saying is, though, is that because they were developed for use in one department and then rolled out across the entire service, your leave tracking doesn't tie in with, for example, the information on what's happening with scheduling. Your leave tracking doesn't tie in with easily with reports that can be drawn centrally for sick leave. So you may have persons putting in for their time and attendance in TRS, one set of data, but because they have to separately submit that same data into their leave tracking report, and because each of these report on a entity level, you then have to go into those separate accounts if you're trying to get across CIG reports, extract that information into a common platform, as I said, typically Excel, and then try to extrapolate the information. But every time someone has to duplicate entry, you significantly increase the risk that the data can be compromised because of human error. So something that's as simple as putting in the information that I was sick on a Wednesday or a Thursday between the two systems could mean that you've actually put in for the last day of one month and the first day of another month, and it throws out the reconciliation processes entirely. And while they may have been acceptable risks when the units are small, when you extrapolate that over 3,000 people, the incidence of error significantly increase. That is also a situation when you're looking at systems that were developed, for example, in computer services, where everybody is IT savvy, and you take that type of system and you put it into environmental health, or you put it into fire, where persons are not regularly on computers, and what you get is, although they have access to the system, it's built up from the bottom where people are doing this on timesheets and someone else is entering the information for them, and then the data integrity is further compromised. And as all of these processes are being reconciled at an entity level, the reliance that you can put on that centrally and the extent to which it becomes real-time data is significantly compromised by the time that reconciliation happens. So the integration that we're speaking of is the fact that other HR functions are reliant upon that data, and while it sits in the system that's available to all users, it doesn't speak to any other system.
Just the question is why?
Yeah.
Why have they not been integrated? Is not what computer services should be doing for you?
And also, just to complement that point, as you quite rightly pointed out, when it was used for smaller individual ministries, the information extracted was reliable. But when we spread it out across the overall civil service, that information becomes unreliable. And my question is, to complement the chairman's, what are we doing to fix this inconsistency? Because surely you will agree, without accurate data, we cannot be expected to formulate strategic planning for future outcomes.
So, Mr. Chairman, I just want to probably shed some light on this issue, seeing that this is something I was involved with in a previous life. We spoke about hardware, we spoke about software, but one thing that many people don't speak about is middleware, and that is the ability for systems to speak to each other. This is not something that is very easily done, and the people who can actually do that are multi-billionaires today, or multi-millionaires from that standpoint. What I can say is, and again, speaking from private sector experience and looking at the report that was actually produced by this report that was actually produced, the information in it is actually quite comprehensive. The one thing I think we should more be focused on is more on what you refer to as end-user computing, in terms of the information that is coming out, testing the reliance of the information that's actually coming out, I think that is what we need to more interrogate than anything else. I think the acting deputy governor had raised the issue, and we're going to get very technical. And I think this is probably where computer services would have come in, as the member from Prospect raised earlier. But the technical aspect of this isn't easy. I mean, when you have a diverse organization with 70 different entities just within core government alone, and then trying to track that, and then having different people doing many different input and everything else, it is a serious issue. But I think looking at the quality of the information that has come out, based on even going through this report, I think that's actually something to, one, a little bit, I mean, credit given to the guys who actually developed the system. Because I can tell you, having worked in banks and telecoms companies, you can go out and you can get SAP and those kind of systems. But those are multi-million-dollar, massive amount of systems to run, especially for an organization this size. So yes, you can probably get systems that can do many of the stuff, but what you're going to pay for it is another issue. I think over time, based on what these guys have developed, as some technology and some things become more available, I think there's opportunity for them to improve the system, yes. But when you start getting into the old middleware aspect now of getting systems to speak to each other, that is something that is very expensive and is not very easy to do. Because I can tell you, as big as HSBC was, they had serious HR issues when it come on to getting a lot of information. And you're talking about an entity that's a multi-billion-dollar, $3 trillion balance sheet. They themselves are challenges. So this is something, in terms of the system, is not as clear-cut as just plug and play. I just need to add that, because like I said, I think this is where computer services need to come in, for them now to basically give us what their plans are going forward in terms of trying to get as much as the system integrated.
I guess one of the questions that I have, which probably complicates the ability to integrate the system, is why do we have some devolution of authority in HR, but we don't have complete devolution? And how do we assure that the devolution that has taken place is in fact effective, or should that devolution, in the absence of complete devolution to the ministry, so that it falls under a minister and a chief officer, is held completely responsible? But as I understand it now, there is HR personnel in each ministry. There are HR personnel in all the major departments. But the HR personnel in the ministry can't make decisions based on their needs, i.e. creating posts, writing descriptions, etc., etc. That's a function that is referred back to centralized. And where does the division come? Because to me it seems like we either need to either completely devolve it and there's no centralized thing, or we have a complete centralized system that manages the whole thing.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And we are speaking about a number of themes that have emerged. So we know that we have an information management theme, as it were. We need better system integration to allow us not only to have real-time information on what is happening across our organization for key HR indicators, but we needed to have the ability to also be a forecasting tool for what we're going to need in the future. Excuse me. But the second theme that you've just alluded to is the issue of what level of decentralization is appropriate. I can tell you that at present we have a high degree of decentralization. From an operational perspective, what positions to fill, what the ways that job descriptions are written, that is completely decentralized. A ministry or appointing officer has the ability to articulate through the budget process what positions they want, and they are responsible for detailing the description of what those jobs functions ought to be. What happens centrally is simply a common yardstick for measuring those descriptions to make sure that there's a common approach to how we value jobs, looking at the job size and putting that against a pay scale. We are not prescriptive in what the jobs, how the jobs themselves are described. And we are not prescriptive in how many positions. And this is a point of actual contention in terms of workforce planning about what the central guidance is on how these things are happening. But right now, that is a very decentralized model. The other area of centralization is not one that is dictated or mandated by law, but has come about by convention because it's been the area that our HR and managers have historically felt least comfortable managing themselves, which is the input for our HR IRIS system. Not by law, but by convention, we process the vast majority of transactions that happen specifically as it relates to payroll changes. And that, by extension, impacts our demographic information that we also use. And we also, on behalf of the advice that we offer to the governor and the deputy governor, we produce our annual HR trends report, which is also available to the ministries and to the departments, but there would be nothing that would prevent them from doing the same on a localized basis, looking at the business needs of their organization. But because they have, by convention, become less involved and hands-on in the management of the data, I suspect that has an implication for how comfortable they are doing the type of reporting that we do at a corporate level. So that's, you know, my observation there. But there is a point to be looked at in terms of decentralization. As recently as when we adopted the our HR hiring practices policy in April last year, we had a modified decentralization because of the moratorium. So at that stage, we were making decisions not about what positions went into the budget. That was something that ministries and departments were doing directly with the cabinet through the budget process. But we were checking to make sure that when they were proposing to go out to advertise a position, that they did indeed have that position within their budget. And so it came centrally to a moratorium committee to review that the position was budgeted before they got permission to go back out to advertise. That was, and the reason why that became such an important function was that when we were under austerity, when there was a lot of concerns about the way that we had to condense our budget or to cut our expenditures when we were operating a deficit budget, a lot of times decisions that were made about any number of expenses, but including budgeted positions, those decisions could be made at the 9th hour, literally as the budgets were coming down to Parliament. So it meant that a lot of times the details that had been developed in submitting the budget, when budgets were cut in large sums, it was not communicated back in a detailed level to departments to know what that meant for the specific positions they had put forward. So sometimes you had individuals, and we saw in the period leading up to 2008, significant expansion in the headcount within the civil service, and there was, we had observed that there were people who were putting in requests to advertise positions because they had actually submitted a request for funding, which they understood to have been approved during initial rounds of the budget process, but actually did not survive when the large sum had to be translated into which posts were remaining within the budget process. And so there was initially in the moratorium process, we noticed a high number of requests that would come forward that weren't actually supported by a position having remained through that budget process. So we were a gatekeeper to make sure that the positions that were going forward continued to be funded in the budget, given the amount of cuts that were taking place in those early years, right up until about 2012, as a minute of last-minute cutting that happened when the budgets were approved. Today, our budgetary process is much more straightforward, and what we found was in the latter years, we were mainly just rubber stamping the submissions that were coming forward because they were, in the vast majority of cases, positions that were funded. And so in the April 2017 policy that went out, we made it clear that departments did need to confirm that the positions were funded on their R drive, which is where we keep that data. And as long as it was, it no longer had to come to the POCS, but where they were proposing to change the position. So they had funds for a position, they called it an accounts officer, but they wanted to turn that into an HR officer so that we still knew what positions formed our funded establishment. They needed to communicate that with us so that we could continue to track what was happening with the positions that had been budgeted, so that we still were able to provide that corporate level response about what positions were funded by the government across the civil service. But only in those cases would they come to us. But before, we received a large number of requests that people had submitted in good faith, thinking they had the budget, only to realize that by the time the sums that had been cut from their budget were translated, that it meant what it meant for the specific positions that had been put forward. And
but isn't that an indictment on the competence of the chief officer, the chief financial officer, the HR person in individual ministries? Are you suggesting that the process of having a budget approved in this legislative assembly, which is usually 6-8 weeks prior to it actually coming into effect, that they do not know but what positions have been approved as much as we go through it and they come down here in detail and answer questions in Finance Committee, and that we have to have the duplication and effort of somebody in centralized personnel actually conforming to a HR person or a chief officer in a ministry that a position exists and that they got a position, that they don't track their own requests to find out whether they were approved or not approved, and you have to do that for them?
2 points I'll make, sir. The first is I was speaking about a historical situation. We are looking now at days when we have $100 million surplus, when budgets are submitted well in advance of the end of the financial year, and when the changes that have to be made can be communicated in detail long in advance and discussed and reflected in our budget documents. This is a very different time and context to what was happening in 2010, 2011, and 2012, when we had significant delays in having budgets brought to Parliament because there was back and forth in trying to get budgets reconciled, and indeed in having those budgets approved by the UK. So the types of cuts that were happening were not always able to be made in the moment in a detailed manner. We didn't, in order to get our budgets approved, we weren't making decisions about you've put forward 13 positions, we're taking out accounts officer 1, we're doing this, we're doing that. The decisions were made in sums, which then had to be translated into chief officer, and this is where the chief officer came in. You now have, you put in funding requests for $100,000 in additional staffing. You have $50,000 in additional staffing. You need to communicate which of the positions you're going to be cutting in that process. And there were times that would take time to be reflected, and sometimes did not get communicated down to the level where people had hiring authority. So down to departments which had the ability to run those. This is not what I'm describing today, which is why that process has been stood down, but it was the situation that applied at the time. The other thing that I will note is that the type of detail that is submitted in a budget is often expressed as the sum of a position that you're putting in and the number of months that that position will be funded for. We provide, as part of our central support to ministries and departments, a phased budget. So if only partial funding has been supplied, we confirm with the departments when that position comes live from a budgeting perspective. We had, and again, this is not typically the case in our current 2018-2019 budgets, but it was frequently the case that positions that had been approved during that 2012-2015 period were often only partial year filled. And so we had to help departments to translate that, so they weren't filling positions in January, which really only had 2 months of funding in the financial year.
Who is held accountable in that situation? Is this part of the problem we're now having with garbage being picked up? Is because we have positions that might have been funded, that weren't funded, that were allocated, and we had a big announcement a couple of months ago by the Deputy Governor's office that they had hired 10 people on a part-time basis. So who is held accountable for having the function performed in a ministry?
I am happy to report that appointing officers are held accountable, and appointing officers now have the information at their disposal to fulfill that obligation. I was describing a time when that was not, the information was not immediately available to them because of the circumstances that I described. I don't want us to get off topic here in terms of workforce planning, but I want to draw a distinction between partial year filling of contracts and what we refer to as temporary hires. And temporary hires mean that we have the ability to offer someone a contract for a period typically of 3 months without advertising it, but it doesn't mean that that person is actually in a partial year filled contract, which means that that could be a permanent position, but it is a position that has not 12 months of budget against it, and there are many valid reasons why that would be, but only has a lesser number of months of funding against it. And part of the reason why people might have, for example, only 9 months is that on average it takes us about 3 months between notifying that we have a vacancy and going through the process of getting someone into that position. So to have people in every instance where they're bringing on a new role put in 12 months is probably a duplication of cost that would never be realized in any event. And so we try to get to more realistic budgeting. So we help them to express it in those terms. But I would also like to add, because you've talked about the resources that are available, and there are a number of assumptions that are made here. Not every ministry has, and you know, to just talk about what we operate in the form of centralized versus decentralized HR. There is our process, our systems of decentralization of HR anticipates that we will have a certain level of strategic HR available at the ministry level to help guide the HR processes and to be a business partner to the chief officer in fulfilling the mandate of that office. But not every ministry employs a chief HR officer. So you will sometimes see that there is actually a void in that strategic element because the highest HR personnel available in a ministry is only at a managerial level, as opposed to being someone that's a strategic
Is that related to the size of the ministry?
In some cases, it's reflected by the size, but in some cases, there seems to just be a business decision to recruit at typically what they refer to as sort of an HR manager position as opposed to a chief HR position. So it's not always determined by the size of the ministry. Some of the larger ministries that you would expect to see a strategic role doesn't go all the way to a chief HR officer. So even in terms of the level of capabilities that are being deployed across our various ministries, they are not consistent. And that also has an implication on the demand sometimes for the portfolio of the civil service to assist. And it's not because our systems require centralized involvement, but it's because the business reality means that we are called upon typically more often in those entities than in others.
Yeah, just for the listening public, they sorry, when you refer to the accounting officer, you're talking about the chief officer. That's the person that is accountable, not the accountant.
Not the accountant. Well, unless the accountant is the financial secretary, who is also a chief officer. But just to say that when we talk about appointing officers, the delegation that allows this decentralized HR to operate comes directly from the office of the governor to chief officers. And they are accountable for their HR function as well as their financial functions and the operation of their ministries, portfolios, or independent offices. They also have the ability to onward delegate HR functions, and so that's how heads of department would also become the appointing officers, and you have the ability for heads of department to onward delegate to sections and units. So you do have HR decisions being taken at various levels across the civil service. I think we have approximately 600 people that are responsible for managing, supervising at least one other.
Accountability and responsibility lies with the chief officer.
That delegation that comes from the governor goes directly to a chief officer.
Through you, Mr. Chair. So it can be said that you all, when you all find these faults or any faults in the systems, you all work with computer services to fix these faults. A perfect example to make it easier for you. When the civil service, which falls under, well, you're only acting, but under the deputy governor, when a post in government is advertised, and then you make a listing, and someone who's not qualified gets shortlisted, and in the long run, you then see your office hire a private law firm to fight a Kimanian for someone who's not even from here, who's not qualified, who should not have been shortlisted, and in the long run cost us money again hiring a law firm. Will the system cut out those type of mistakes? Where someone is not qualified, they should not be shortlisted, but they are.
Mr. Chairman, through you, civil service recruitment is one of the most scrutinized areas of activity. We have the highest level of transparency in our processes, as well as accountability that takes us to a dedicated tribunal service, as well as the fact that just about anything we do is front page news. So I say all of that to say that the IT systems that we are seeking to employ will certainly better enable our recruitment and selection process. And I think part of the value there is not only going to be in terms of the timeliness that it will afford us, but it will also allow us to be able to operate with even greater objectivity, in that it will allow us to be looking at applications, and one of the current areas for discussion around HR is generally looking at bias and unconscious bias, and the extent to which our systems seek to ensure diversity of the persons who make up the organization, and that we're not conforming to just hiring people who think like us, went to the schools we went to, or are of whatever unconscious bias that we might employ. Certainly when I first became a chief officer, the person sitting around the chief officer table looked quite different. And so I can say that we are consciously and looking at making sure that persons coming into the civil service feel welcomed, and that we are having a civil service that is representative of the society that we serve. As it relates to the very particular hypothetical that has been put forward by the member, I don't want to get into matters that are currently being adjudicated, but I can say that what is available in such circumstances is transparency through freedom of information. There are appeals that are available if someone feels aggrieved of that allows individuals to go to the Civil Service Appeals Commission. There is an audit process that can be employed, and we have our HR audit function that is now subsumed within our internal audit services, and there is the ability ultimately where the investigations or irregularities have been found through audit, all the way up to recommendations that can be made to the governor for the revocation of a delegation. So there are any number of checks and balances that are built into the system. Improving our IT would just be an added layer to what already applies.
Mr. Chairman, it is often said that good judgment comes from experience, and experience comes from bad judgment. I say that to say, and I wanted us touch on this issue of the systems. Having been previously a director at the HSA, I remember the transition to the Cerner system. The chairman at the time told the minister it would have been best to have taken that system, put it in a box, and put it in a shelf. The hospital has not been the same since that system went in. I say all of that to say this. When we're talking about responsibility, the problem started right here in this Legislative Assembly. We passed a law that basically decentralized vast areas of government, and we basically allow these ministries or these chief officers to pretty much function within a certain period. I think if memory served me right, between 2005 and 2009, the civil service went from roughly 2,600 people to 3,800 people, with $90 million a year being added on the payroll. And this is why legislative impact analysis and everything else is always needed to avoid these issues, because when you go from 2,600 to 3,800 people, and then right at the end of it, you go into a global financial crisis, you pretty much, the civil service has been playing catch up since in terms of trying to get everything organized. No, I'm happy to see that they have developed and launched a 5-year strategic plan to become a world-class civil service. The issue that I have, and to bring it back to why we're here today, is on the old workforce planning. I mean, I noticed the Auditor General comments, and I'll just read it here for the listening public, where it says, the audit found that The Civil Service had developed and launched a 5-year strategic plan in January 2018 with a vision to become a world-class civil service. The plan recognizes that transformation and achievement of the vision needs to be delivered through its staff. The government has started to collect baseline information against which it can measure its performance over the 5 years. The audit goes on to say, there is no organization-wide workforce plan for the civil service. Neither do ministries nor departments have workforce plans. There is no agreed approach to workforce planning, which means that it is being considered which means that where it is being considered, it is being done on an ad hoc basis. It also goes on to say that the roles and responsibilities for workforce planning are not clear, and the civil service has a network of HR professionals across the government, 55 in total. I raise all of this, Mr. Chairman, to trying to look forward. I mean, we know where we are, we know how we got here, but I think the purpose today is how do we move from where we are? And what I would really like to know from the acting deputy governor is in terms of to address these audit points that have been raised, valid points, where it says there's no organization-wide workforce plan for the civil service. What steps are being taken to basically, for us to successfully achieve workforce planning? And what I would also like for the for clarity for the acting deputy governor to just advise the committee is what is the process being followed to move us from where we are to achieve what it is that they want to achieve over the next 5 years. Thank you.
Mr. Chairman, through you, I thank the member for the line of questioning, because he's absolutely right. You know, we can talk about how we got to where we were and what applied in the past, but our focus and our energy really needs to be on a forward state. With that in mind, sir, the 5-year strategic plan really looks at addressing the underlying factors of HR that are relied upon in workforce planning. And, you know, I'm going to have to say that while our desire is to continuously improve and to be world-class as a civil service, we have successfully taken this organization through some very difficult times. And the yardstick that was applied, the business strategy that was driving much of the government's certainly its annual budget statements and its strategic budget statements, and this has been confirmed as recently as the 2018 strategic policy statement, which acknowledged that over the past 4 years, the government's fiscal policy was really focused upon achieving compliance with the FFRs, the financial fiscal framework. That was a driving imperative of the government. And as it relates to workforce planning, HR was a major component of fulfilling that, that mandate. So our HR teams and our leaders across the organization, sir, I would have to say, responded. And what am I, measuring that by? If the compliance with the FFRs was our sort of driving imperative, and we look at our data between June 2008, which was really when our moratorium had been adopted and was sort of the time when the impact of the global recession was being felt locally. Through June 2015, the civil service reduced in headcount from 3,904 to 3,484 persons being employed, which was a reduction of 420 people, or 11% of our civil service. When we talk about workforce planning, we may not have the longhand division, but we responded to the imperative, and we did it while still facilitating government's other driving imperatives. We saw government services grow at a time when we were reducing headcount. where we've had introduction of things like freedom of information, reception classes in our public schools, the adoption of a new constitution with the commissions that came on board as a result of that, and the commission secretariat to support it, the return of the weather service from our statutory authorities back into core government, the focus on e-government, the establishment of Office of the Director of Public Prosecution, the evolution of the National Workforce Development Agency, the establishment of our needs assessment unit, our response on the financial services front to things like tax information exchange, and I could go on and on. We expanded the areas that government was providing services at a time when we were reducing headcount. We did so without any of the sick outs or rioting that many of the other territories that we speak to will talk to you about. We are talking about having attempted a more business-like approach to the way that we operate HR, and we have done that not under duress. We have continued to look at how we innovate the way that we facilitate government services by being more business-like in our approach, even to our HR strategy. And whereas other territories that are now looking at a similar decentralization that would put the authority and accountability on their chief officers, some of those other territories only took that move when their constitution was suspended. We took that bold step, and some of the places that we look to and esteem still delegate the responsibility for how they are choosing their staff to fulfill their business functions to public service commissions that are about as far removed from the business as one can get. So I say all of that to say we clearly have a long way to go, but I don't want to by any means underestimate the contributions that have been made by HR professionals and by managers across the civil service to meet the specific needs of the country and people of the Cayman Islands and to respond during some of the most challenging times when they did so. Moving forward, we understand that now that there is a resumption of a more business as usual, the yardstick for measuring the success of the civil service is changing. It's not just going to be about what our head count is, but the extent to which we are delivering world-class services, and that means a different model for our KPIs as HR professionals supporting the businesses that exist within the civil service. So we have, in our 5-year strategic plan, identified that we need to have better tools to do this. We also understand that we need to be able to better organize our various professions, HR being one of the key professions that needs to be reorganized to fulfill this mandate in the times that we're currently facing. To that end, we've hosted a meeting of the strategic HR professionals, persons who are at least on a grade J and above, so have some managerial responsibility for HR. And we began to really challenge the way that they are looking at their role and what they have identified as being some of the impediments to them fulfilling a full modern function of HR, moving from being so focused on compliance to being value added and being able to do the types of predictive analysis that would allow workforce planning to take place. We also have been mindful that we shouldn't underestimate the impact that we have had and the particular challenges that we have within the civil service. Our goal is obviously in workforce planning and in succession planning that we're going to be talking about to increase Caymanian participation within the organization. And I note in the Auditor General's report, there was a proviso that perhaps we need to be looking at succession planning in a wider sense than just looking at Caymanians who would be filling these key roles. I can tell you that our statute is very clear that that is our priority, and that we speak to succession planning as being about the identification of key technical and managerial positions and having a pool of Caymanians who are able to fill those roles. But if we were to look at this from that sort of 30,000 feet, while the civil services, as of our 31st December 2017 report, are 73% Caymanian, When you look at that as a percentage of our Caymanian labor force, the civil service has approximately 13%, so more than 1 in 10 Caymanians work within the core civil service. And when you take that into the broader public service, the amount of Caymanians working there, we represent about 22% of the Caymanian workforce or labor force as reflected in the ESO Labor Force Survey Spring 2018 report. So the 22% of the Caymanian workforce is employed within the broader public service. So more than 1 in 5 Caymanians are already employed within the public service. So it puts in context the challenge we have in raising the needle to increase representation within the civil service and in being able to continue to attract persons to those key managerial and technical roles, because our primary focus is trying to get Caymanians into those positions, and we already have a high penetration of the Caymanian labor force market. We also note that some of the challenges that we're going to have to be mindful of is how do we contend with, and this has been reported before, the issues of the graying of the civil service, the extent to which we have persons who are facing retirement that are holding key positions, and how we're going to be looking at their replacement. I can say that even for the chief officers, since about 2012, we have had some 8 Caymanians appointed to chief officer positions. Currently, of our chief officers, I believe we have only 2 persons who are non-Caymanian, and only one of those of our positions that we are forecasting to become vacant over the next 5 years. And for the, although we do have 3 persons acting now, which includes the person that's acting for me while I'm acting for the deputy governor, 1 position that's been vacant, and 1 position that has only very recently become vacant in the last 2 months. So there are 3 chief officer acting appointments at this time, but we have had high success rate and have recently recruited since 2012, the vast majority of our chief officer positions. So even from the very top, we have a pretty solid record of having been able to recruit from within to fill those positions, which is a large part of our strategy for succession planning. We've also been able to enjoy each year particular success with promotions within the civil service. So we've focused heavily on training, looking at the types of skills that are going to be needed across the civil service so that people can take advantage of those opportunities when they come up. So some of the challenge that we've experienced, particularly on the succession planning front, has been about, and this is manifested in workforce planning, do we have formal tools? Do we have a formal methodology that's been documented and that persons are able to bring up real-time reports against? And what we're finding out, and this report confirms, is that that isn't the case. But the shorthand division is still happening. Even without those formal reports, even without systems that you can print off every day that's going to tell you that information, we are doing the types of things within the organization that allows us to recruit from within, with a high percentage of Caymanians, the vast majority of our chief officer positions being able to be filled by internal promotions of Caymanians. We are developing our staff so that they can take advantage of those opportunities. Every year we have about 150 persons across the civil service that are promoted. Over the last, I think it is 4 years, we've had, I've got to pull up some information here, but I think it's been over the past 4 years or so that we've had in the range of 400 persons that we have brought into the civil service as interns, and we have had a significant percentage that have been offered permanent placement who are under age 25. So we are doing a lot of things that are happening across the organization at a local level and at a corporate level, but this information becomes dated the moment that someone captures this in a succession plan, because our systems do not allow for this information to be maintained. The information on the persons who form part of a succession plan isn't updated because it doesn't speak to our demographics information. So when someone gets promoted and they've already secured another job, that doesn't automatically get reflected in our succession plans because they tend to be more static. So we're not getting full credit, understandably, when you're looking at workforce planning, because you're not going to find documents that perfectly summarize what is happening across the organization. But if you look at what is the practice and how is that being reflected in our experience in filling positions, we are having significant success in being able to fill from within our key positions. And we are investing significantly in training and development of our staff, particularly looking at the management functions that they're going to need to be successful in those roles, but increasingly looking as well at the leadership functions and what's going to be required of leaders, both now and in the future, because we are moving from a command and control type of organization to an organization where persons are going to be called upon to be able to really motivate their teams, be able to articulate visions, be able to strategically plan for the changes that are happening, not just within the civil service, but externally, and that are impacting this country. And that requires a different set of skill sets that might even have been captured 5 or 10 years ago in the ways that jobs were described. So this is a part of the work that's happening with our core competency framework, looking at those common skills, and we've been significantly investing in those things to help get people prepared. We also know that, just as I've described has happened even during that period of austerity for us, the types of positions that will exist 10 years from now will be very different to the ways that we describe positions. The titles might not exist currently anywhere within our organization. So we're trying to focus less on who's going to be the next, whatever that IT role might be, and to speak more about what are the skills that we see as being in demand and providing training against those skills. So there are some constraints even to workforce planning when you get much beyond that sort of 5-year horizon, and this is where we kind of have had some discussions about what is expected within the organization, because we're improving things like performance management, we're improving training and development, we're improving the ways that we're going to be seeking to recruit and attract persons to the organization. There was discussions about what's our retention policies. Well, we don't have that documented anywhere, but we also have pretty good retention of staff. So, it's looking at what is the reality on the ground versus do you have a list of policies that we can tick off as having been present, and what are the reports that you can provide against those policies. And on the latter two, we're going to, we have noted challenges. We're not fulfilling that aspect of it. And we know that there is some frustration because a lot of the work that we propose, if we were to do it right now, would become dated the moment it was filed because our systems aren't integrated and don't have the ability to update that work. But in practice, we are having success with being able to fill positions largely through persons who are within the organization, and we are having a high degree of success in being able to attract Caymanians, with the exception of certain professions where the demand for labor labor overall has been challenging for the organization, not just in terms of being able to get adequate Caymanians, but looking at the demand for example, education, and what that means in terms of being able to fulfill those type of roles by having even higher penetration of the Caymanian workforce if we try to Caymanize every one of those positions. So, you know, when you take out of the equation the particular professions that are very labor intensive, education, police being two examples, you look, the percentage of Caymanians that are represented in the organization goes even higher because those two professions tend to be where we have the most challenge in getting all of those positions or the majority of those positions to be filled by Caymanians. So we're looking at what is the context of that. But if you look at in practice what's happening, we have had a high degree of success, and that's looking at it from the macro picture in terms of Caymanian, percentage of the Caymanian workforce employed within the public service, as well as our ability to fill key roles such as chief officer roles from within.
Mr. Chairman, I just want to thank the acting deputy governor for that comprehensive response. I wish that more people in government would be as knowledgeable as the acting deputy governor. The thing, in terms of yardstick, which you touched on, the yardstick, one of the yardsticks for me is going to be the government use of consultants. I mean, earlier this year, we went through the whole almost $35 million spent in the last 5 years on consultants, which is average $7 million a year, which basically, for one, tells me that some of the expertise, or a lot of the expertise that government would need that costs money, isn't available in the civil service. But just two of the things that jumped out to me, and again, I'm looking at your annual HR report, 2016-2017. I noticed on page 17 that over the last 18 months, 542 people had left the civil service. Now, considering that you were starting at, and this is a core government, by the way, considering that you were starting at 3,600 as per your report on page 2, and you have 542 people left, which is roughly around 15%, if we do that roughly, of which 380 were Caymanians and 162 were non-Caymanians. 15% of your people leaving, considering that these are people that we could have probably invested in, or that in itself is quite concerning, because that is above what the normal is in other organizations. And then on the succession planning part, over the last 18 months, again, as per this report, you went from 3,600 employees within core government to 3,778, an increase of 178. But what jumped out of me with that increase is that of the 178, 70 were Caymanians and 108 were non-Caymanians. So again, the issue or the question for me is, where exactly is the training and the development coming from? Because when you have 542 people leaving in the space of an 18-month period, that is a significant number when you're starting at 3,600. And then when you look at your iron practices, your growth, of the 178, with 70 being Caymanian and 108 being non-Caymanian, it basically says that there is still a gap somewhere along the line that we're not addressing. And I think what I'm looking for more is what steps are being taken to, in essence, have a stronger retention, but at the same time, because one of the things the Auditor General noted was the lack of exit interviews. So we had 15% of the people left, and we pretty much kind of don't have a concrete idea as to why they would have left. So that's a lost opportunity in terms of maybe finding out what's happening. It could be a situation where a good portion of them was also managed out too. I mean, so that in itself is also there. But in terms of looking at the trend going forward, even with the growth within the civil service, it is growing at a faster rate of non-Caymanians as opposed to Caymanians. And that, I think, is something that needs to be addressed.
Through you, Mr. Chairman, and I thank the member for his question. In looking at the information, as you said, that appears on page 18 of our annual report, of that 542, we have some broad categories explaining why they left, because you're right, we do need to look at that generally. 5 died. There were 18 that were dismissed, and you can expect those numbers will be growing. We had 221 at the end of their contract. So keeping in mind that we have at any given time somewhere between 24 to 26% of the civil service that are on fixed term contracts by virtue of being non-Caymanian, we expect that as those contracts are ending, we would have another opportunity to look at whether a Caymanian can be put into those positions, to look at whether the position is still needed or if it was a form of consultancy that was brought in as temporary staffing, or sometimes that number could mean that persons elected to leave at the end of their contract, or it could also be a way of it was not offered as a contract renewal, but oftentimes gets caught up in this broader category of end of contract. So I say all of that to say that we do have some indication, although these are categories that are still pretty broad. I mean, we had persons that were retired, some on medical grounds, as well as transfers to our statutory authorities. The use of exit surveys would certainly give us more detailed information, and we've had some departments that heavily use them. I was, you know, it is again a tool that is available, but has not been as widely taken up, and I know that there had been, you know, some departments that felt they had been burned when this then all became FOI'd and all of these details were published, and it may have had a chilling effect on them wanting to be as proactive in getting this information that it's a management tool. And we've had to say to them, you know, don't be short-sighted in the value that your exit survey is going to give you. It is another tool very similar to our engagement survey that helps you understand what are the factors at play within the organization, and indeed where you might have, you know, they say people don't leave organizations, they leave managers, right? So it gives you another way of being able to provide that information. What I can say is that while we don't centrally facilitate the exit surveys, some departments continue to do that decentrally, but what we have introduced since last year, and we have just completed again this year, is across-the-board engagement surveys that delves into the working conditions and the issues of staff across the civil service. So that is a way of our also being able to capture what is happening, hopefully before it results in someone getting fed up and actually leaving the organization. So we do have some central tools for looking at those sorts of issues, but we agree having the exit surveys done more routinely would be a very useful tool, and it is something that we're looking at adopting as part of our KPIs for the profession going forward, one of the regular things that HR will report on across the organization.
Through you, Mr. Chairman, from a governance standpoint, wouldn't it be best for those exit interviews to be done by the non-department? I mean, this is an opportunity now to really evaluate, because I'm going to tell you what I'm uncomfortable with is we talk about the number of dismissals. It is the lack of dismissals at the senior level. And that, for me, is really where the issue is. Because, I mean, when you look at the departments that are the leavers, the most leavers in terms of Caymanian, sorry, you had District Administration, 97, left over 18 months, Education, 48, environmental health 14, immigration 24, police 15, public works 15. When you start drilling into, health regulatory services 24, when you start drilling into the actual breakdown of who's leaving where, those are some of the same departments that have the same challenges where the public is concerned. And what I'm afraid of is that, as you said, people leave managers. And we need this information. And I think this is where POCS needs to come in now and independently go through the process. Because the very same people are doing the interview that the person is leaving, what are they going to say? I just say they're getting burnt. Well, they need to get burnt because the public business can't be done in private. And the management issue within the civil service is one of the things that the public really needs more confidence in. The junior people are always leaving most of the time, but we need more senior people gone. Well, not you, but...
Not me yet, right? No. Well, through you, Mr. Chairman, the member has a point, and part of the numbers here that I would say is, and the Auditor General's report prefaces this as well, sometimes on the percentages game, small departments are misrepresented. Because if you're a department of 5 and you have one person leave, you have a 20% turnover rate, right? So that's one caveat I would say. The other thing is, and you mentioned district admin, and I feel compelled, it's in the report, but I also feel compelled to talk about, no, I know. But again, when you look behind the numbers, so this report will say, for example, that 45% of Caymanian leavers had less than 1 year service on leaving the civil service. This is largely related to the opportunities offered for Caymanians on Cayman Brac in short-term office attendant 3 roles. Whereas the internship program offered on Grand Cayman tends to be over the summer or the Christmas for 2 or maximum 3 months of duration. It is structured in Cayman Brac as a gap year program, so that before, as young people are leaving school, before they are of age to head off to university, either here in Grand Cayman or abroad, that they have that ability. So their internship program, because it's outside of just the 2 or 3 months that are offered for the others, their numbers get caught up in the employment numbers because they offer them a year's program, and then they roll over and another group comes in. So some of what you see manifested, for example, in district admin would be because of that program where they have a significant number of 1 year appointments for school leavers during the gap year. We centrally have some indication of the types of programs that are employed. We also know that sometimes there's a significant disconnect between the perception and the reality. So the perception that the turnover in particularly the uniform services is so much higher, when you look at the numbers, that isn't borne out. But then you get some functions where we do see that turnover, and it coincides with other indicators that we have. Those could include our engagement indicators. This could include grievances that we are aware of, matters that we speak of from employment relations perspective with the Civil Service Association. That gives us a full picture. And you're right, those are the cases when there are pointed discussions about leadership performance.
Mr. Chairman, whilst I do have 2 specific questions for the Acting Deputy Governor, I would like to defer to the member for Georgetown South, giving her an opportunity to engage in this conversation.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, through you to the Honourable Acting Deputy Governor. My question relates to resources and information to support workforce planning and management in the report. In paragraphs 79 to 85, report that the Cayman Islands government had around 55 human resource staff to support its workforce at December 2017. In Exhibit 9 on page 33 of the Auditor General's report, government's HR staff to workforce ratios compared to human resources management benchmarks at December 2017 shows that the Ministry of Education, Department of Immigration, and Ministry of Community Affairs HR staff levels are below suggested benchmarks, but NWDA and DLP levels are higher. I don't think that the report is suggesting that the government needs to employ more staff. But my question is there any progress made in reviewing the distribution of the HR, some of the HR staff, in that the Ministry of Education is at a lower level versus NWDA?
Through you, Mr. Chairman, the ratios are illustrative of what organizations tend to have in terms of the number of HR professionals versus the number of staff. There are a number of factors that impact how this actually operates on the ground. There's a certain critical mass that you need in order to function, and so the ratios may seem higher for small departments just in order to have some representation of HR be present in the entity. And for larger organizations, they may seem to be underrepresented. And I know that particularly for large departments, there may even, for small departments, there may be no presence of HR, but rather the HR function is being fulfilled by a manager who dedicates part of their time to HR as opposed to having a dedicated HR professional. The situation that you've specifically alluded to relating to the ministry versus, and I'm trying to remember the relationship here. So I'm understanding this is the Ministry of Education versus the Department of NWDA that now sits under another ministry?
That's correct.
Okay. So the way that, again, we've been on a journey with decentralization, and when it was first rolled out, there was two models that had been put forward, and one model was continue to have HR as a centralized shared service, enter into service level agreements, and have dedicated team that is located centrally who supports your ministry and departments in fulfilling their HR obligations. The other model was buy and build your own. And without exception, every ministry chose the buy and build your own model. And over time, initially that was manifested in HR being deployed across the organization, not just at the ministry level, but at the entity level. Over time, it has been the practice that most ministries have re-centralized HR to the ministry as a shared service that's available from the ministry level, unless there is a large department, a police, for example, or there are pronounced challenges there, or a particular strategy at play. So for example, Public Works Department will have a dedicated HR team that includes having someone that's responsible for strategic learning and development. And they have a very particular strategy in place that's also about developing persons in that sector to be able to take up leadership positions, not just within the organization, but also helping to develop almost a trade training facility for the island generally, because they have access to that expertise. So there is the ability to centralize even at a ministry level versus decentralizing it to the departments, and most ministries do that. So you would think the problem would be resolved if the shared service sits at the ministry level. What has happened in practice is that ministries will change significantly in size following elections, and the ratio of how do you get, I think there were some percentages here, so the suggested ratio, and it's been put against the different sized entities. So the suggested ratios was the for an organization of 1 to 250 full-time employees should have a ratio of 3 to 40, and for an organization of 251 to 1,000, 1 to 22, and a lot of times it gets down to how do you reallocate those resources, knowing that the numbers aren't always illustrative of the expertise that's available. I spoke to you about the fact that across the ministries right now, even though some ministries may have more staff in HR, they may have no presence of strategic HR. So they're taking an approach where they're putting more operationalists and deploying them to the problem than they are a strategic facilitator, organizer, leader of the profession within the department. So because there are these different models at play, it is not always as simple as 1 for 1. And I think the ratios are just meant to be illustrative, but because in practice you don't have a common approach that's being deployed in the way that ministries are choosing to build and manage their own HR function, it has brought us to the conclusion that we need to go back and have a discussion with the people who are accountable for the function of their ministries to say, how are we delivering HR across the civil service? It would not be acceptable. I'm sure the audit office wouldn't be too keen to be receiving accounts for audit that have been submitted by the financial administrator or the accounts officer 3. But we somehow don't take the same approach to the people that are advising on government's single largest investment, its people. So we are having discussions at a chief officer level about understanding how you relate to HR professionals within your organization and who you need if you are going to have a build or buy your own model. Then you need to have a certain level of expertise at your disposal in order to fulfill your mandate. But we're also having discussions about what that minimum capacity would need to be across those organizations, even in places where, education is a prime example. Education has certain drivers to its business which are different than the business imperatives for other organizations. Every August you need to have a certain number of people that have been recruited in order to get schools open. You have a high rate of evolving sort of clarity on the education strategy, which impacts who those people need to be and what skill sets they need to have, with particular emphasis of late on making sure that you have people who are support services to allow greater inclusion of people who have different learning challenges. So somebody that's able to articulate that, develop the recruitment strategy, and deliver it would be very different than perhaps the type of strategy that's being deployed at another ministry. So I say all that to say that it is not always as simple as saying one entity has 5 and another entity has 3, because the skills that they have and the ability to translate the business strategy into a talent strategy varies significantly from one entity to the other. That was very evident when we met with the strategic HR professionals across the government, when we had them in a room and we were talking about what is the future direction of the profession and what do we do now? How do we spend the majority of our time now? And if you could imagine a world where IT was integrated and available to you, how would you spend your time differently? And how many could articulate that, and how many were able to demonstrate the value added that they had in their roles now? So there's more work that needs to be done. But if we're also talking about adding additional ministries, we need to be mindful that the business model that we take to shared services, that even having it at a ministry level may not be the most efficient level of shared services. And it doesn't mean that everyone needs to come back to the portfolio of the civil service. I'm not suggesting that at all. But ministries have the ability to be significantly volatile in their size and focus from one election to another, and having the HR professionals being able to be as agile as that pace of change in terms of who's part of their team and the skill sets that they bring to the team. We may be creating additional pressures that don't need to be contended. So we have to have a discussion about the business model. And we currently are looking at, and the previous member mentioned the use of consultants. There are some times when it is useful for us to have an objective facilitation of a conversation. We don't want to be perceived as having skin in the game and having a view as to what level of shared service, a centralization of shared service is appropriate. But we have seen, just from one election cycle to another, the difference in the ability of HR and finance, even at a ministry level where they're concentrated, to be able to cope with the changing scope and focus of what now constitutes that ministry. And that has implications for the way the business is able to be delivered. So we need to go back to the table to say, when we launched this in 2008, this is the view we took. Do we take a different view in 2018 as to how we do this? And if we were to go with the recommended ratios for all of these entities, what would be the cost implication, and what would be the implication in terms of the market, the supply side of this? How many Caymanians with the skill sets that we need are we able to replicate across this organization in all those ministries in order to fulfill this mandate? And when a ministry reduces size, what is going to be our view of how that resource is utilized going forward? And sometimes these ratios can be a bit nonsensical because you end up with 3/4 more person than you were supposed to have, right? So when it is centralized at a ministry level, it will create certain inefficiencies from a staffing or financial perspective, but strictly pursuing a model that's just based on efficiencies could also compromise the level of proximity you need to the business to deliver what you were established to do. So there needs to be a balancing of those two perspectives. And so that conversation has started at the profession level with the strategic HR professionals, and we have brought on board, well, we're currently in the process of considering bids to bring on board an entity that can help facilitate the discussion on what level of centralization of the HR service should we have, what's the structure of that, to talk about our readiness assessment. So we've talked about that there are certain HR functions that need to be operational for workforce planning to operate. So we're going to be looking at our readiness assessment for where we are in our progress with performance management, with talent acquisition, with learning and development. And we're also going to ask that consultant to help us look at a framework that would be suitable to the businesses that we operate in government, so that we can have a common way of articulating our workforce plans going forward.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I was just going to add that we very clearly give those for indicative purposes only. I think the one point that Exhibit 9 demonstrates is post-election, big chunks moved around, and the people move around that perform those functions, but I don't think government gives enough thought to the support functions that support those big groups of people that move around. So Exhibit 9 is a reflection of what's happened to some extent after the change with machinery of government. And to Miss Gloria's point, where you've got different business models of departmental HR functions versus ministry HR functions, it does lead to potentially you not having the right mix of HR skills where you need them, because a department is unlikely to be able to afford the strategic HR function. So all of those things I absolutely support Ms. Gloria, really need to be thought through. It is only indicative, we're only saying it's indicative, but there needs to be thought given to the support needed and at what level.
But isn't the short answer to that just to comply with the Constitution? In that the governor sets the ministries and any politician coming in takes the ministry or leaves it. The preposterous idea that we allow a particular politician to cherry pick subjects which become so disruptive to the efficiency on HR and accounting is preposterous. And that's what the governor is for, and the deputy governor. Establish the ministries, and they sit there and they have the synergistic effect, and you have these skills that remain in-house. What we're trying to do here is simply to accommodate the wishes of some politician and some fringe element wanting some particular subject which probably has some corruptive value to it more than anything else.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Chairman, I'm grateful to you for raising as an example the issue of garbage collection, because I believe it is an excellent example that points to the gaps in workforce planning that the Auditor General's office has highlighted in this report of April 2018. I would like to refer to Appendix 2 on page 43, which is the recommendations page of the Auditor General's report. Recommendation number 1, located on page 43, states, the government should ensure that ministries and large departments develop workforce plans to ensure that they can deliver their long-term strategic objectives. These should be organization-wide workforce plan for the whole of the workforce needs in the longer term and how it plans to address these. I read that only to state that I would suggest that garbage collection is the government's short, medium, and long-term key objective. The management response to this recommendation was that the Portfolio of the Civil Service would implement a 5-year strategic plan workforce strategy that was launched in January of this year and spreads or spans from January 2018 to December 2022. We have spoken in great detail, I think, about the demand for labor and the need to fill human resources with the budget approvals that were gained in the Legislative Assembly. But I think when we look at the Department of Environmental Health responsible for garbage collection, this isn't so much about a demand for labor or filling gaps in resources, vacancies, or otherwise, but this is an example of what I think the Portfolio of the Civil Service means in their 5-year strategic plan, Objective 2.3, demonstrating accountability and high performance. What is lacking on DEH is the will to terminate persons who are not fulfilling the job requirements, persons who are guilty, if you will, of on-the-job infractions, but it touches on a subject which is not oftentimes raised in the civil service, though we do note in this report that the HR report, there were some 18 terminations within the civil service. My question here is, what, as part of our workforce planning, attention and priority is being given to the accountability factor and removing persons who are not fit for purpose in the roles in which they have responsibility for? And a good example of this can be seen in the current Department of Environmental Health, and in particular, the persons charged with collecting garbage.
Through you, Mr. Chairman.
And certainly, just to that point, when we talk about accountability, and I thank the member from Bodden Town West for reminding me, the Honourable Acting Deputy Governor in previous evidence stated that the appointing officers are held accountable for these ministries, but ultimately the chief officer is held accountable. Now, whilst my question is deliberately focused on the individuals on the ground, whether be running the garbage trucks, picking up the garbage, failing to complete what is a day's schedule to do a full road, but they only do half the road so they can rack up overtime and fundamentally play the system. But this has also been ongoing for some time, that it necessarily follows that whilst those on the ground should be held accountable, certainly those in senior management, appointing officers and chief officers, should also likewise be held accountable in their performance appraisal or otherwise.
Mr. Chairman, through you, I thank the member for his question and also his reference to our management response. We concur, and you know, when we talk about how much preparation is being made for workforce planning, our 5-year strategic plan has the key ingredients, I think, to developing the type of talent outcomes that are necessary to become a world-class civil service that is making the lives of those we serve better. So it is a significant part of our roadmap towards having our workforce planning being fully operational. You mentioned that one of the key objectives that fall within, and you talk about objective 2.3, that objective is under the goal of leadership. We have 5 goals within our 5-year strategic plan: customer experience, leadership, talent development, communications, and good governance. And we think that those are, you know, the keys to consistently being able to deliver a world-class outcome. I would say that the UK Civil Service Workforce Plan summary talks to there being 3 broad priorities that have been established by their Civil Service Board to improve the commercial capability of the civil service, ensuring that the civil service is world leading in terms of digital transformation, and improving the diversity and inclusiveness of the civil service. And then against that, they also have 5 themes. So we're not that far apart in terms of what would be articulated at a corporate level, just to provide some clarity and manage expectations as to what we'd be doing there. But under the leadership goal, you spoke to objective 2.3, which is demonstrating accountability and high performance. I would also point to 2.1, which is fostering world-class leadership. The performance ultimately of these, any of our departments, all of our departments, hinges highly on accountability and upon leadership. And we are very clear that leadership needs to happen at all levels. There are some people who do not have any formal responsibility for leading others, but are still expected to lead themselves, including leading themselves to work every day, leading themselves through the workday, fulfilling the functions that they are being paid to do, and leading themselves into the proper training and development that would allow them to participate in future employment and promotion opportunities. And while the vast majority of our staff, I'm happy to say, and our leaders do us proud, even during our most difficult days, we have some persons who are, to use the expression that we recently explored in a leadership training session, you know, we need people that can help set the momentum, the pace for our achieving a world-class status. And you know, those are the people that we expect to be our runners, and we expect the people in formal leadership position to be a part of those runners. They're going to be doing the difficult things that are called upon for a leader, including having difficult conversations and holding people accountable who aren't performing. And on the other extreme of that, we have the people who are the passengers on our bus, who aren't doing anything to help us fulfill our mandate and are simply enjoying the fruits of someone else's labor. And that can be highly demotivating to the teams that we're otherwise are giving their all. So we are looking at what is the performance of those individuals and how is this being captured in their performance appraisals, and where you have people that have been passengers for some time and are not helping us to move towards being a world-class civil service. What is the common denominator in terms of the leadership that we have, and what are the difficult conversations that are being had there? Now, there is a process, I can assure you. You know, it used to be that a large part of the mantra that we had as leaders is that failure wasn't an option. We don't say that any longer for very real reasons. We want our leaders to also be innovators. They have to take risks and try different things. But when you have someone that you are leading who is consistently letting you down, and it's continued to be tolerated, then that does have to be addressed. And we are, there are conversations that happen right down the cascade. And those conversations are captured in writing, and those performances are being addressed.
What is done about them at the end?
Yeah.
I just want to take a practical approach to this. Using the example that the member for Prospect said, we have supposedly, according to the press, the problem with the collection of garbage is that drivers are not turning up to work. Those drivers have a supervisor. If that supervisor is not doing his job, that person has a supervisor who should be seeing that that person doing their job, right? That person coming all the way up to the chief officer. Where in this thing, the department head has evaporated like Elijah in a chariot. We don't know what happened to him, why he left, what he got, or anything else. But above the department head exists the chief officer, who is ultimately responsible and ultimately accountable. Because Management 101, you can delegate authority, but you cannot delegate accountability or responsibility. At what point do we hold a chief officer accountable because a department head has blown millions of dollars or whatever the reason is, and garbage is not being collected on the street? Apology by the deputy governor to the public because a chief officer has not done their job is not good enough for this committee.
So I would just say that there is, I want to acknowledge the sterling work that I think is happening by the leadership team that has been parachuted into the Department of Environmental Health. Mr. Sims.
It's worse.
And Mr. Sims.
Garbage is picked up less. The law, the public health legislation requires that garbage be collected from residential areas twice a week. It don't happen in our side once every 2 weeks now, much less twice a week.
The operational collection of garbage has for some time been the response has been to at least have garbage collected on a weekly basis. There was systemic issues that the leaders faced in going into environmental health, that did not happen overnight. And they have been making steady progress that is reflected in the increased reliability of the equipment that was previously routinely reported as being down. They are getting that equipment up and consistently running. They have had noted challenges with persons who are who have not been operational, or either because of poor attendance records, or in some cases persons who had for a long period of time been on alternative duties, although they were still showing as being part of the collection crew. The team has gone through getting those files put together and getting a definitive response on those issues as to whether these are medical issues or whether these are persons that need to be put back to work. They are cleaning up a backlog of issues across the board that have impeded the performance of that department, and they are making steady progress. Now, I can tell you that that also means that when apologies are coming out, and unfortunately, you know, they'll be the first to admit they're not world class yet, but they are making strides towards it. Those apologies are coming out at the appropriate levels from the department to acknowledge that regrettably it has not met its targets, and to communicate what it's doing to address those. So I would reiterate what the Deputy Governor, Mr. Manderson, has said. We are very apologetic for the situation that has occurred at environmental health. We beg for the public's continued patience because there is new leadership at the department. They are making steady progress, but they have a significant amount of issues that they are attempting to remediate, and there has been, in some cases, willful challenge to being held accountable, which they are taking through the proper disciplinary channels. And that has meant these leaders even being involved in writing people up themselves to make sure that there is a timely response, an appropriate response to when people are choosing to be passengers instead of being the high performers we would expect of our team.
Through you, Mr. Chairman, the two primary excuses that we have been given is equipment failure and personnel. I am then curious as to why then take the person who was in charge of equipment or who would have been responsible for the equipment failure, downtime, whatever. You then take that person and then you move them to the department to which they couldn't get the equipment for. I mean, this is not to cast anything on the director there, because I think he's a highly competent individual. But the argument that it's an equipment failure issue, and then you take the person who's in charge of the equipment and move them to DEH, really doesn't make sense from the public standpoint. So we believe it has to be more than equipment then from that standpoint. And it can't be a situation where the management of the department has changed and the problem still continues. So clearly then, it can't be an issue at a management level. But the thing about it, what I want to get at and what I'm trying to understand is the overall governance. Section 15 of the Public Service Management Law is clear as to the duties and responsibilities and the powers of the head of the civil service, which is the deputy governor. And looking at the very report that you guys had produced, one of the things that jumped out to me from a governance standpoint, and this is what I'm trying to understand, and since it's included in your report, I look at Cayman Airways, again, looking at page 2, just looking at the demographics in terms of, for the 18-month period between June 2016 and December 2017. Cayman Airways staff headcount remained flat at 393, but the non-Caymanian number went from 32 to 56. So it went up by 24 non-Caymanians and it decreased by 24 non-Caymanians. I look at Children and Youth Services Foundation, CASE Foundation. That went up by 6 employees. But when you actually look at the actual breakdown, it was less. The number of Caymanian employees went down 5. The number of non-Caymanian employees went up by 11. Then look at Maritime Authority. They went up by 17 staff, of which 5 were Caymanians and 12 were non-Caymanians. And what I'm trying to get from this, from a governance standpoint, is where is POX, or in all of the governance? Because ultimately this responsibility for the management of the public service still resides with the deputy governor. And granted, some of these organizations also have their board and everything else, but from a governance standpoint, especially when it passes the public authorities law and everything else, where does the deputy governor really put his foot down now? I go back to the very first question that I'd asked the governor last year at the MLA orientation. I think you were also present when I asked Governor Kilpatrick at the time, what does it take for a senior civil servant to be fired? And in particular, I called out for the Commissioner of Police, who resigned but was still given a year's salary. And these are the kind of things that we need to know, that, listen, at the end of the day, yes, mistakes get made, but what we do expect people to do is own those mistakes. And if needs be, someone needs to be fired, but we can't have the issue that we have, continue the garbage, and a director's, the chairman said, left like Elijah in the chariot, and then nothing else. I mean, it is not apology, it's accountability, and that's what we're looking for.
Mr. Chairman, through you, and I noticed that the member had a number of parts, so I'm going to try to recall them. Going back to his question regarding the governance of the wider public service and the numbers that he reported as being the representation of Caymanians in some of the various statutory authorities. I referenced page 1 of our report, and it speaks to the source of our data. And I specifically will read this section that says, data relating to the civil service has been taken from the Cayman Islands government's central HR database, HR IRIS. Statistics relating to the wider public service have been compiled from self-reported data provided by each respective statutory authority and government-owned company. We have no way of otherwise validating or knowing what numbers are at play within those SAGCs other than through their own self-reporting. But this is our attempt to fill that void so that we can at least get the highest level of overview across the wider public sector. But you will note that we don't go into any further detail other than headcount and Caymanian versus non-Caymanian, which comes exclusively from their self-reporting. I can further add that our website has updated information because upon our publishing this initial report, a number of the SAGCs, or at least I think 2, came back with some further revisions. So I'm looking at our report, which says that we had revised June 2016 data submitted by Cayman Airways and UCCI following publication of the 15-16 report, and revised June 16 and December 17 data submitted by Macy following initial publication of the 16-7 report. So,
sorry, just to be clear, my question I'm looking for was governance.
Right.
In terms of what role then, if any, does the portfolio of the civil service play with these entities? Because at the end of the day, and this goes back to the discussion I had with the Honorable Franz Madison, in terms of should it be the portfolio of the civil service or should it be the portfolio of the public service? Because at the end of the day, I mean, someone still has to give an account. Now, they're included in your report, so somewhere along the line, I guess you guys felt the need to include them as part of the service. So from that standpoint, then, and going back against the governance now, with the public authorities law, you have now, we'd have to go through the ministry and have to go through even your report for the civil service for key management position, remuneration and everything else. So there is an intent to increase the governance for some of these runaway entities, and this is what we're trying to get at, is what governance. I mean, how do you guys put your foot down? Where do you guys put your foot down and say, you know what, this can't work, this is not in line with what it is that we're trying to achieve? Because at the end of the day, if you're trying to build a world-class civil service and you have roughly almost 2,000 people out there in statutory authorities and SAGCs, well, 1850 or thereabouts, as part of the public service, and they're not included in what the vision that you're doing, then how do you bring them into your vision? Because this is a material amount of people that you don't want them becoming mavericks and doing something else.
Mr. Chairman, I mean, I'm going to try to differentiate debate on the ideology of what governance model should be at play and just speak to the governance model as I understand it. The powers of the portfolio of the civil service are largely found in the Public Service Management Law, which is the employment framework for the core civil service. The same is true of the deputy governor, although the deputy governor is also a recognized constitutional position. As it relates to the public authorities, there is a governance model for them as arm's length bodies, which sees their boards as being the primary agents for addressing the governance of the entities. The the Public Authorities Law seeks to extend that, but the approach that was taken, and we can get into debate, and you know, I'm sure there are views on either side, but the approach that was taken in the end was that the enforcement of that Public Authorities Law for the SAGCs, the implementation of that law has been vested in chief officers to fulfill. So the role of the deputy governor isn't articulated as such in the Public Authorities Law. And as it relates to the portfolio of the civil service, we do have an envisioned role currently for the evaluation of your chief executive officers or the heads of those statutory authorities, and in next year to become to assist with the evaluation methodology for the for all staff. But the governance, the reason why they're included in our report, although we don't have sight or responsibility for their HR, is that this is a basic metric that any country is asked to report on. What is the size of your wider public service? And while we don't have immediately at our disposal the information to do that, we have sought their cooperation in providing that information so that we could provide at least that highest level of report across our wider public service. But we aren't able to get into the granularity of the analysis that we do within the core civil service because their information isn't visible to us.
Sorry, and that's exactly my point. The Public Authorities Law give the chief officers basically the oversight powers or whatever need to be the governance. They're the ones who now play a more active role. But the chief officers are still accountable to the deputy governor. So the question is this then, if the chief officers aren't doing their job in terms of enforcing that law or doing what they're supposed to do, then the question is, at what point does the deputy governor steps in to deal with these issues? And that is really what I'm trying to get at, is who ultimately is as to be the one to put their foot down. Now, and the reason being is that when you do read the Auditor General report, we spend a considerable amount of money on salaries. Now, the money, I mean, even though Section 55 of the Constitution is clear in terms of the reserved powers of the governor, I think somewhere inside it also says providing money has been budgeted for it, which means then that the legislative body, this body, we're the ones setting the money aside, so we need to still make sure that we're getting value for money. So the question is now, for the money that we have voted that is being spent on salaries, at what point or how is that money being held accountable? Now, if it is not you to answer the question, then the question is then, who do we need to bring in? But someone still needs to let us know who's accountable for that money that we have voted.
Mr. Chairman, through you, this esteemed body has the ability and does routinely bring in persons who have been allocated monies through the budgetary process, and you have the ability, as you are doing with me, to ask questions of them about the expenditures related to their entities, including how they are addressing the expenditure of their personnel budget and the fulfillment of the governance of their organizations. And this is something that, even beyond the employees, you will have representation from members of the board of those statutory authorities and government-owned companies that can speak to the broader governance issues. And then, wearing my substantive hat, persons like myself will also come down here as chief officers to talk about the governance responsibilities we have for the SAGCs that fall to our particular ministries or portfolios. And ultimately, the Deputy Governor has responsibility for the performance of the Chief Officer across all of their areas of responsibility. And as someone who spends the majority of her time, with the exception of the past 5 months, as a Chief Officer, I can tell you that the mandate is growing considerably and shows no sign of letting up the areas of responsibility. A chief officer, though, will have, this has also been explained and reported on from looking at the governance of statutory authorities and government-owned companies, and looking at the mechanisms that are available for chief officers in fulfilling that function. And it is not a direct, it is not as direct a oversight role as you would have, for example, for a department head that reports to you. Individuals who lead SAGCs are appointed by their boards of directors. Where a chief officer or a member of that ministry or portfolio sits as a member of the board, they are currently not in a voting position. And even if they historically had been in a voting position, they are one of any number of votes. So, a lot of times, the wherewithal that a chief officer has doesn't always come from an authoritative position, but you are still expected to be able to have sufficient influence on the outcomes using at your disposal the tools that you have. So if you are concerned about the performance of your statutory authority, you can, for example, call upon the Office of the Auditor General to investigate that performance so that you have a basis of addressing that through the board. If you have issues of the sort of mandate and the extent to which the functions of the statutory authority align or do not align with the government's priorities, then you have the ability of going through the minister to issue directives that clarify what is expected of the statutory authority. So, even when we are talking about how chief officers would in practice fulfill that obligation, I thought it was, it was worth just pointing out that it is not as simple a reporting line or relationship as with a direct report. The governance structure is a bit more indirect for our SAGCs by design, for better or worse.
Okay, well, I'll ask you in a roundabout way the same question I'd ask the governor. What does it take for a chief officer or a senior civil servant to be fired? Not paid out, fired.
The provisions for dismissing a chief officer is identical to the provisions for dismissing any other member of staff. If the issue is one of gross misconduct. There is the due process that every human being is entitled to, where you put to them the allegations, you give them an opportunity, which includes whatever evidence has been collected, you give them the opportunity to respond, you consider the response, and you issue your decision. They have the right to appeal if they are aggrieved with your decision, and subject to the outcome of that appeal, if there is an appeal, the decision proceeds, or there may be some sort of settlement because there's a concern about the soundness of the decision. That is the same disciplinary process that's at play for any other member of staff. Now, if it isn't gross misconduct, there are warnings, or there are starting off with informal conversations to say, I am concerned about, for example, a performance issue, but that will escalate if it is not responded to in formal ways that lead right up to ultimately dismissal if your performance isn't corrected. What I would say is that oftentimes the issues that can present themselves for people who are in the most senior leadership roles aren't hard infractions, but can sometimes, there is a different yardstick for persons that are in the positions that sit directly beside official members and ministers, and in addition to the hard infractions that any other staff member might have, for a chief officer, there's also a requirement that they be able to maintain the confidence of their and the relationship of their minister, which is absolutely integral to our process of being able to run a ministry or portfolio, which is an added layer that the rank and file civil servant would not have to contend with. But otherwise, a chief officer has everything rank and file and then some.
But
Okay, sir.
shouldn't it be sufficient that a chief officer acted in a way in trying to dismiss somebody that cost the government millions of dollars in settlement? Shouldn't that be sufficient for dismissal?
So I get back to the point, and I can tell you that historically, we have had cases that have gone all the way to the Privy Council with persons that were former, no longer within our civil service, but were chief officers at the time. If we hold our staff, to the position that if any employment decision that you take should be overturned and result in a settlement, and that's going to be the basis upon which your employment continues or is discontinued, then we would have, I would say that it would have a even greater chilling effect on our ability to encourage managers to hold people accountable. There's any number of issues that could go wrong, and indeed for dismissals or non-renewal of contracts, we have had, I would say, probably a significant number of ministries and portfolios and independent offices that have had rulings that have suggested that there should be some compensation because of a procedural issue. Most times it's borne out that the decision itself was sound, but a procedure may have been skipped, and so some compensation is offered for that, but the tribunal looking at it is very sympathetic to what the organization had to face, because as you will see, there are a minute number of cases that actually get to an actual dismissal, and we are encouraging people to have these difficult conversations and to take action. And so simply having an adverse decision at court, I would not say is adequate to say that someone should not have, someone should be fired because they made a decision that got overturned at court.
I'm not talking about decisions that make it to court. I'm talking decisions that are settled with a gag order with millions of dollars reportedly, which the public we have no way of knowing what it was and why it was settled, because it's settled with a gag order and the famous non-disclosure clauses. We're not talking about, I'm not questioning where things are, the person is actually fired and they then go for a judicial review and the court overturns the decision. My question is, when a chief officer tries to terminate somebody, and particularly if the problem is procedural, that's even worse, because they at the very least should know what the procedure is to terminate somebody.
Okay, I realize we've kind of gotten a little bit off topic, but I think why this line of question is important is that part of proper workforce planning, especially where employees are concerned, and the reason why I'm raising this, I think I discussed with you once already in passing, is that when you have a government retirement age of 65 and you have chief officers pretty much in their early 40s, that is 20 years worth of seniority that possibly blocks a lot of young talent coming up. Since I've been elected, I've had one chief officer mysteriously taking early retirement after showing up at the PSE shortly thereafter, and I had one that sliced and diced it any way you want, got a demotion to go to another statutory authorities. When you look at the power and the responsibilities that has been vested into the chief officers, I mean, ultimately, they report to the deputy governor. And what it is that we are looking for is that when you look at the amount of, if you want to retain talent within the government, people need to know there's some level of mobility. And the last thing you want is a person with 10, 15, 20 years of job security at the most senior level, basically, and a young person coming up and saying, I'm looking in that area, that job is packed off, this person ain't going anywhere anytime soon, I'm taking my talent elsewhere. Because people also, at the end of the day, still needs some ability to grow in their field. And that's the reason I said to you that if you're going to give someone 10, 15, 20 years of job security, they need to literally be walking on water for a very long time. And for that reason is one of the reasons why we will continue to hold people, because in essence, they are blocking progress. And as you said, they're passengers on the bus. And at some point, some of these passengers need to get off the bus.
Yep.
Mr. Chairman, a couple of points there. There was a time when our promotions were predicated on purely or heavily how long you had been in the civil service, okay? And that meant that the demographic, in terms of the age of the person that got promoted, was perhaps more suitable to, people being within reasonable sight of retirement. I can tell you that there was no one on either side of the aisle or anywhere in the civil service that advocated that that was a model that we should continue. Now, the average age of our chief officer group now is approximately 48 years old, okay? And I'm gonna tell you which side of the equation I sit on, but you're right. That does bring with it certain challenges. This is, whatever ministry you sit in, whatever independent office you sit in, it is a demanding job. It is not a 9-to-5 role. You don't ever go to the supermarket and you're off duty, okay? And so being that, whether this is something that someone, is gonna do for 20 years, it remains to be seen. We've had some individuals in the past who have managed to be at the highest levels for many decades and retired upon reaching the statutory retirement age, and will tell you they still had gas in their tank and were ready to do another 10. Most evenings by the time I get home, 65 seems very doubtful. So I say all of that to say that when we were looking at raising the retirement age, the policy was put in place at the same time because we knew that we needed to continue to make way for new ways of thinking within the organization while balancing the commitment and that individuals have had to the organization and their ability to continue to be productive members, not passengers, but productive members within our organization. And so when we raised the retirement age, there were amendments to the public service management law that also allowed individuals to step out of leadership positions, either instigated by the head of the civil service, who had the ability to, in order to facilitate succession planning, to move someone out of a leadership position but preserving their salary. But this isn't something that could be done for disciplinary reasons. So this had to be done genuinely for succession planning reasons. And there's the ability for persons to instigate on their own that I would like to be able to take phased retirement where I am going to preserve my right to both pull a pension while pulling my salary, but I will take a lower paid position. So that's the way that we balanced being able to introduce a higher retirement age within the civil service while also facilitating the type of mobility that will allow new eyes on sometimes old problems, and as a way of ensuring that people still felt optimistic about their future within the civil service and that we could continue to fuel innovation and bring vim and vigor to these leadership positions, which I assure you are very demanding.
Thanks very much. Just a quick question. I'm winding down my questions now. On page 9 of your report, sorry, again, this is the annual HR report. I noticed that within education, 35% of the employees are above the age of 50. The police service has 28% above the age of 50, 50 and above, sorry. Prison services, roughly a third above the age of 50. And public works is 44% above the age of 50. Now, from a succession planning standpoint, I mean, one of the things I'm concerned about is that, I mean, what are the steps that are going to be taken, especially in those departments, to start recruiting and training talent? Now, a couple of weeks back, I sent the Commissioner of Police a message I came across on one Caribbean island where they built a police academy within the university that pretty much just trained just the law enforcement courses, where those guys literally came out with degrees. And when I look at the issue at police and prison, particularly two, what do you call it, law enforcement areas, and they also look at maybe even case foundation that deals with rehabilitation and so forth. Like, wouldn't it be suited for government to start looking at setting some of these specialized programs to start training and developing future talent from that standpoint? So that's one of the things I'm looking at. And the next issue, which will be my final question, of course, provided there's no follow-up, is with regards to remuneration. When you look inside the new batch of the civil servants coming up now, most of them, I think, the pension is at 12%. Is that what it is? So it basically means then that for every 8 years that they work, well, every 8.5 years, they literally would have accumulated 1 year's salary before any investments or anything. Now, if a person even spends, say, 40 years within the civil service, they, in essence, then would have accumulated roughly 5 years' worth of salary. And if you invest it, you may even get 10 years. If you're retiring people at 65, and their pension under this new system now, the most they may have is maybe money up to 75. But then you have people living to 82 for women, sorry, 82 for men, 84. Sorry, let me just collapse it, sorry. What I'm trying to get at is I've seen now where the government is now taking up the same problem that the private sector has in terms of retiring people, because you had noticed in your report here, and this is what jumped out at me, sorry, is when you said in September 2016, the public service raised the normal retirement age for the civil service to age 65, aligned with the increase that was adopted for the private sector. Now, within the private sector, there is no set retirement age. What we do have is an age in which you start paying pension. So my issue is that looking forward and looking down the road is that now you have people living longer, and if you're retiring them at 65, and the most they may have now is pension lasting up to, say, the age 70 to 72, and they're living 10 years past that, what are you guys looking at in terms of setting a compensation model to not create a social welfare in the future?
Thank you, through you, Mr. Chairman. There's a number of assumptions in that question that don't quite hold out in our scenario, if I could elaborate. Whereas under the private sector, the accumulated sum that you've spoken to that would determine essentially how long you have a pension because of how much you put into it, even under our defined contribution pension scheme, which the vast majority, over 80% of our civil service, active, I should say our public service, our active participants participate in, that is an annuity. If you live to be 120, you will continue to receive a pension. There are certain assumptions that are made that most of us in this room will not live to be 120. But if one of us manages to do so, the annuity that is created at the time that you retire is not exhausted when you turn 80. Okay? There are assumptions that are made and calculations that are made, and it is for that individual's lifetime. And that is an actuarial assessment that is based upon the mortality rates and any number of other factors that are at play. So that doesn't happen. The other thing I'd like to say—
Sorry, before you move off on that, no. There are two types of pension. You have defined benefit and defined contribution. The defined benefit is the one that you're talking about, where that one continues on. The defined contribution, whatever you put in is what you take out.
So I can, again, I think it's very important that this point is understood. Our defined contribution, the calculation for the annuity is based upon what you put in, unlike a defined benefit. But both crystallize as an annuity upon retirement. Okay? So that's the first point. The second point is, since we raised the retirement age within the civil service, we have had the vast majority of people who were shut out at age 60 from being able to contribute, who have gone back into contributions, and a significant number of people who have elected, although they had the ability to leave at age 60, who have elected to continue to work longer and to save more so that the amount that they put in, that the annuity would be based upon, has an ability to grow. So raising the retirement age has manifested in the benefits that we sought, where people have stopped pulling their pensions in order to go back into contributing to their pension plans for existing staff, and people have been inclined to work longer as a result of having the opportunity to do so by going to age 65. There are still some persons who work beyond 65 as our law allows, but their existing contract, the one that would allow them to continue contributing to the plan, that matures and expires, and it would require them being offered a new contract to work beyond 65. So we are seeing people working longer in the organization than they were before age 60, and they are getting the benefit of that is reflected in their pensions upon retiring. But even though the calculation is based upon what their accumulated sum is, both by direct contribution and the performance of the investments on their plan, it still gets converted into an annuity for that individual. So I just wanted to clarify that point. I can also say that in terms of what are the other ways that we are trying to make sure that people are able to live in dignity upon retirement. A lot of this, particularly for people who are on a defined contribution plan, but also for defined benefit, is going to be predicated on the salary which is drawing the pension contribution to begin with. And we have had, both in 2015 and again this year, cost of living adjustments, and we have had honorariums, which didn't attract the pension, but we have also had the pay stagnation remedy that was implemented year and a half ago, that also allowed persons to increase their base because their performance and was factored into the increments that was awarded to them, their performance and tenure within the organization, all of which impacts how they are making contributions towards pensions. So there's been a number of, to your point about pay, a number of matters that have been addressed from structural pay, in addition to increasing the retirement age, in addition to allowing people for the first time ever who had retired out of the plan to actually suspend taking their pension in order to re-enter the plan as contributors. So all of these things have been done in order to facilitate people being ultimately ready for retirement when they either elect or are reach the new normal retirement age.
So one of the things one of the benefits, and I'm speaking from when being a former civil servant myself, of joining the service was the health care that you get upon retirement, and you had a much better pension plan. Now, the private sector pension plan of this 10% is, in essence, it is an insufficient amount to maintain someone's salary, plus when you factor in the mortality rate. The government has upped that by 12%. The same problem that the private sector had, government has now imported in with the defined contribution plan. And this is a fact. This ain't opinion. This is a fact. When you start looking at your average, because when you look at your, you're talking, I think in your report, 28% of your civil servants made between 40 and 50,000, but there's still roughly, I think, 51% that's still made below 50,000 a year when you factor in everything. 70%. Yeah, and when you start taking what their retirement going to a defined contribution plan, and when you take the 12% of what it is that you're putting into a pension, under that plan, what you put in is what you take out, not the other way around. That's that. And even, I mean, if you're lucky enough to get a good investment that even doubles your money, that's fine. But the reality is, what you're going to have is as soon as people reach the age of roughly 75, we may not have this problem now, but this is a future problem that we have across the whole Cayman Islands. And it's even worse in the private sector, because what we have found is that the civil servants are now subsidizing the private sector retirees through cynical. I mean, this is a serious problem. And yes, I understand government made the decision back then because of austerity, the measures and things were tight. But this is a situation where we're kicking the can down the road. And one of the things that, the reason why I raised it, one of the attractions that government had, being the medical and being with a better pension in the private sector, you had better talent. Now, if you're going to go now and do pretty much offer a pension that is similar to 2% more than what the private sector is offering, then your ability to attract and retain talent, you know, competing a little bit more.
Mr. Chairman, through you, and not to belabor the point, but there are a number of structural changes that distinguish the pension offered through the Public Service Pensions Board, not just to public servants, but to members of the judiciary and to members of Parliament. And one of the other things that I would say about that is a distinguishing factor, and I think the fact that there is an annuity is a significant distinguishing factor from what happens in the private sector. But the other thing is there is no cap on the percentage of your salary that you're earning a pension contribution on, whereas there is the employer match, so the 10% that you're talking about, is capped for the private sector. It doesn't match all levels of your earning. The other thing is, in terms of the baseline of earnings within the civil service, and I agree, our staff work hard, and we are not the highest paid in the land. I accept that. But we're also not the lowest paid in the land. There's no one within our civil service operating under minimum wage. So, and when you look at that and you look at the benefits that we offer, I think that's for people who are looking for an organization where they can be a part of over the long term. I think the civil service has an attractive offer, and I think that may be a part of why we don't see high percentage of people leaving after those 2 years, because they do realize that this is a part of the value proposition of working within the civil service. The value added of our benefits, including our non-contributory health care, although it is limited in our options of healthcare provider, and the fact that our pensions are both higher in the matching rate of contribution. They are not limited by the salary cap, and they are not limited in terms of being a fixed amount that is paid to you and is exhausted. It is calculated to last your lifetime. So I would say that this is a part of our, I think, unique selling points, which continues. It is certainly a difference between a defined benefit and defined contribution plan, but even with a defined contribution plan, I still think that the offer within the civil service and the broader public service, as most of our SAGCs, while they may not participate in Cineco, they do participate in our pension program. I think that is something that is recognized as being value added, and so even persons who aren't compelled to participate in the SAGCs, by and large, do so.
Well, I think that I think we've kept an hour longer than we promised, and we don't want to have you to make it cancel too many appointments. But I want to have one or two questions in terms of succession planning. There are two sections in the Public Service Management Law, Section 26(1)B and Section 40(1)(4), which at the very least inhibit succession planning because the government requires you to advertise the position, right? And in Regulation Section 25 also requires a thing to allow proper and effective succession planning. Is there any plans to amend the two sections of the law and the regulation which will enable successful succession planning?
Thank you for that, Mr. Chairman. And I would like to say that we do listen to the advice that is coming out of this esteemed body through the Legislative Assembly, and in our discussions when we are able to have them one-on-one on performance challenges across the civil service and how we can operate a more effective employment offer. The sections that deal with having to notify a vacancy is really meant to fulfill our obligation as a public service, realizing this is not a family business, but this is the public's funds that we are spending. It's really meant to ensure meritocracy, and that there isn't, persons aren't making employment decisions based upon who they know. But there is acknowledgement that even the law envisions how we notify vacancies is at the discretion of the appointing officer. So one of the practical things that we have done since our early engagement with members when we were talking about HR has been looking at, given the first opportunity for senior level positions as internal promotions. So we've been notifying the positions internal to the civil service for many of our senior positions rather than going external as our first advertisement. Now, that has its advantages and disadvantages. Part of the talent plan approach within the UK has been just the opposite, to try to bring in more commercial scales by advertising externally in the first instance. So we do know that there are pros and cons to that approach. But we've been reflecting further to say that we can ensure meritocracy without having to deal with advertising a position at the tail end. So we can still have a competitive process for how someone gets onto a succession plan, and then deal with once there's, the person has been assessed. And in some departments, I should say, this is done currently through a promotion board because, for example, the only viable candidates to take up a leadership role, to be a senior prison officer or whatever, would come from within. It's not as if there's another department across government that was going to be able to do that. So there are some very limited examples now of how persons are forming promotion panels internally without notifying vacancies. But by and large, the majority of people try to facilitate the ensuring meritocracy through advertising. We're going to look at whether we can provide some comfort to people that there are other ways to address that obligation and shared commitment we all have, without having people feel like they have gone through extensive training and are still facing significant uncertainty as to whether they will be offered a position in the end, particularly where their role is one that is very specialized. We've been doing a lot with succession planning ourselves. We were able to recruit from the private sector an individual into a field that is particularly hard to attract Caymanians to, which is the audit profession. We had investment of the individual within our organization, and they passed with flying colors a number of additional qualifications that we sought for them to have in the audit profession, as well as undertook and successfully passed the leadership training that had been set for them. Now, in order to fast track their deepening understanding of a range of audits, they are on a 15-month secondment supported by ourselves to the UK audit office. So some positions do take, sorry, I should say the internal audit services within the UK. So some positions do take more hands-on.
And that is the other problem I have with the whole manpower planning. One of the things that I can't find, I'm not saying it's not there, but I don't find any deliberate recruitment of the top scholars in the island, for instance, to fill specific roles within government's own manpower requirements, i.e., and you get back to bonding those people to work in the civil service. A case in point is a large percentage of the people in the children's services are over 50. Where is government in terms of recruiting some of the bright students to become social workers and offer them 100% scholarships as opposed to a unrealistic $20,000 check to go to some back-of-the-wall university? Where is the link between government's manpower requirements and government itself funding the education at a higher level to attract better graduates than what we're getting now?
Mr. Speaker, again, and this is where the numbers in isolation can be misleading. So, for example, for the Department of Children and Family Services, part of what drives up their numbers is that this also includes caregivers. So, by and large, persons who are attracted to the caregiving field, who work in the homes, whether it's Maple House or those similar homes, there doesn't tend to be a difficulty in filling those positions, but there are more mature persons who tend to be attracted to those positions. So they're not all social workers, as an example. Similarly, there was a discussion about education, and a lot of the people who participate in what they refer to as supply teachers, so they are the substitute teachers, if you were, who come in when a teacher or a classroom needs to be supported. Those, again, tend to come primarily from retired teachers. So this is a way that these are examples of how there are certain departments whose strategy is a certain reliance upon mature persons to work there, and there's not foreseen to be a challenge to getting them. They've been readily available for those purposes. But you're right. For some positions, we're going to have to take approaches that are in some cases going back to what we used to do, the situation you referred to in terms of attracting the brightest and bonding them. I mean, our current policies do allow us to bond students. Our employees, I've paid for expensive specialized training for members of my staff and bonded them to work in our department so that we could utilize their services after they attain their qualification. So that can happen even within a department. The person who we are grooming for audit services, we fully intend to be able to call upon for audit services. This is a significant investment by ourselves, but knowing that we had to take new approaches to trying to ensure Caymanians are able to participate in a managerial level in the profession. We are seeing new opportunities arise with the establishment of the work department that will give us, as the largest employer, better insight into the supply of labor and talent that is available and coming through the pipelines. Again, we don't necessarily at this stage know exactly what the position will be called, but we know that there are certain skills that are being acquired by persons now who are on training, that it is better for us to acquire those skills than it is to try to rely upon developing them internally. And that's particularly true for things like IT. It's much easier to get someone who already thinks that way to go into these roles. And it's not just about the IT profession. The way that we deliver the majority of our services is increasingly having a digital context to it. So we know that these are skills that are in high demand, and whether they be in the audit profession or whether they be in HR or whether they be in finance, people who are comfortable utilizing technology will generally be able to take up key positions more easily. So those are the types of things that we are looking forward to engaging with work about, because we know that our organization is going to be in high demand of those skills, and certainly those are some of the areas we would hope to be able to have an opportunity to bid first for that talent. Our law already allows us to make appointments of such persons without having to go through an interview or recruitment process. So we can make appointments without open competition where it is a returning graduate. So we do have that facility now, but we need to be able to have better sight and connect the pieces so that we can do that.
No other questions?
Mr. Chairman, through you, I'd like to say thank you to the acting Deputy Governor, and to say that to sit here and listen to your answers, and only one of them I saw you kind of go around the edges, but I do hope the other chief officers will sit here and listen to you and watch you, and you don't come here and try to tell us any falsehoods, and you don't have to look behind you. You don't walk with the entourage of people to have to answer, to look for get questions from. And I want to say thank you, ma'am, very much for your forthcoming answers today. And I do hope one day you don't have to toe the company line. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much for your time, Ms. Gloria. Sorry to keep you late, but
Mr. Chairman, sorry, I just really want to thank the acting deputy governor. She has always been on point, always well prepared, always well informed, and a true testament of what it is that we are striving for within the public service. So as I join my member, a colleague from West Bay North, I hope that other chief officers are taking note.
that having been said, we'll adjourn for lunch and be back at 2 o'clock. Thank you.